I see that man who's supposed to be my husband, who's supposed to love my kids and us, standing in the corner with his hands over his head like this, and I'm looking like, what is going on? Maurice is screaming. Maurice says, call the police.
All of this while one of her sons was screaming. She then walked into her daughter's room.
I was screaming her name, and I was like, what did you do?
She tried to call 911, but the dispatchers couldn't understand her. She then went to her neighbor's house.
That's when I heard the gunshot go off. I ran back over to the house, and that man was on the floor in her room. And I just grabbed my daughter and I held her until the police got there.
Now her family is looking for answers, one of those family members saying they want Maurice to, quote, suffer. And despite him being her husband of 20 years, Tanya wants justice to be served.
It's kind of hard to say that, but at the same time, it's what's needed to be done for my daughter because she didn't deserve that.
It was July 20th, 2024, a quiet Saturday evening on the 900 block of Adele Street. The street was calm, almost sleepy, lined with modest one-story homes where porch lights flickered and cicadas hummed in the dark. Nothing about this neighborhood suggested horror, until the sound of a single, muffled cry shattered the silence. Inside one of those houses, chaos was unfolding. When first responders arrived, summoned by desperate calls about a disturbance and a possible shooting, the scene they stepped into was a nightmare. Blood on the walls, overturned furniture, and the metallic scent of violence hanging thick in the air. On the floor lay a young girl, motionless, her life cut short before it had barely begun. Nearby, an older man, her father, was slumped against the wall, bleeding from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. That girl was 17-year-old Maria Pollock. And the man who pulled the trigger on himself after taking her life, was her father, Maurice Pollock. For a moment, it didn't feel real. Paramedics rushed in, calling out vitals, checking for signs of life. But the truth was immediate, and it was brutal. Maria was gone. The innocence of that quiet Savannah street was gone with her. As police secured the scene, neighbors gathered in clusters behind yellow tape, their faces lit by the pulsing red and blue lights. Some cried. Others just stood in disbelief. Nobody could make sense of it. Maurice was supposed to protect Maria, not destroy her. In the days that followed, the story would unravel like a tragic play. One marked by years of quiet strain, hidden frustration, and the kind of emotional decay that hides behind family photos and forced smiles. But in that moment, under the flickering light of police cruisers and the low murmur of radio chatter, one truth had already been written in blood: a father had killed his own daughter. Maria's death wasn't just another statistic. She was a child, a dreamer, someone who still had her whole life waiting beyond the Savannah skyline. And yet, her final moments would play out in the one place she should have been safest, home. The call came in just after 9 p.m. The dispatcher's log described it as a domestic disturbance. But that sterile phrase could never capture what really happened behind that door. Witnesses later said they heard shouting, loud, angry, filled with desperation, then silence, then a sharp cry that chilled the night air. And moments later, a gunshot. By the time police entered, Maurice Pollock was barely conscious, a handgun nearby, blood pooling beneath him. His daughter's body was found only a few feet away, her injuries not from the gun, but from something even more horrifying. Investigators would later confirm she had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds inflicted with a box cutter. The crime didn't just end Maria's life, it left a family destroyed and a community reeling. As crime scene tape fluttered in the humid breeze, detectives began piecing together the final moments leading up to that deadly night. What could drive a father to commit such an unthinkable act? What led to the rage, the snapping point, the irreversible choice that turned love into something monstrous? That's the story we're about to unfold. A story of love turned lethal. Of a young girl full of promise and a father harboring darkness few ever saw. Because sometimes, the most haunting crimes don't begin in dark alleys or deserted woods. They begin at home, in the heart of a family that looks ordinary from the outside. This was the night that Savannah would never forget. The night innocence died behind a familiar door. The night Maria Pollock's voice was silenced forever. Maria Pollock was everything a 17-year-old girl was supposed to be: vibrant, kind, and full of life. She had a smile that drew people in and a laugh that made you forget your worries, even if just for a moment. She loved music, dance, and the little moments that made life feel beautiful. She was a junior in high school, thinking about senior year, prom, and the uncertain excitement of what came after. College, travel, freedom, all of it lay ahead, waiting for her. She had dreams that stretched far beyond her Savannah neighborhood. But behind that dreamer's light was a reality far more complicated, one that not many people saw. Maria lived with her father, Maurice Pollock, a 43-year-old man who once had a quiet reputation in the community. He was seen as hardworking, though distant, a man who mostly kept to himself. But those who knew the family more intimately described a growing tension between father and daughter. The kind of tension that builds quietly over time, not from one fight, but from hundreds of small ones. There were whispers that Maurice struggled with controlling behavior, the kind of control that hides under the guise of protectiveness. He wanted to know where Maria was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Friends said she often had to leave early from hangouts because her dad would call, asking where she was. Sometimes he'd show up unannounced, insisting she come home. To some, it looked like a worried father. But to Maria, it was suffocating. As she grew older, that tension deepened. She was no longer a child, and she was starting to push back, wanting independence, wanting a voice. Still, she never stopped trying to hold things together. She'd post smiling photos, attend school events, and laugh with classmates, keeping up the illusion that everything was fine. Police would later learn there were no previous domestic calls to the home. No documented signs of violence. But that's often the case in tragedies like these. The warning signs don't always show up in reports or records. They live in silence, in the things people don't say, in the moments they brush off as just family stuff. Maria's closest friends later said she sometimes avoided talking about her dad altogether. When his name came up, she'd grow quiet or change the subject. They didn't push. No one ever thinks to. But as weeks turned into months, those quiet cracks in their relationship began to widen. And soon, everyone around them would realize, too late, that Maria's home wasn't the safe haven they believed it was. For every photo of her smiling, for every sweet message she posted online, there was a growing darkness just out of frame. And on that July night in 2024, all the pressure that had been building inside that home would finally explode, in a way no one could ever have imagined. The signs were there. The unease. The tension. The hidden pain that no one dared name. But the truth is, no one ever expects the people we love to destroy us. In the weeks leading up to July 20th, 2024, something in the Pollock household began to shift. To outsiders, it wasn't dramatic. There were no police visits, no screaming matches spilling into the street. But for those close enough to notice, the change was unmistakable. Maurice Pollock was unraveling. He had always been strict, even controlling, but now that control was turning into paranoia. He started calling Maria constantly, demanding to know where she was and who she was talking to. Her friends remembered the way her phone would light up again and again during hangouts, his name flashing across the screen, unanswered, followed by another call moments later. Maria had always tried to keep the peace. But lately, even she couldn't hide the tension. She started spending less time at home, choosing instead to hang out with friends or stay late at school. When people asked why, she'd laugh it off. "My dad's just being my dad," she'd say. But behind that small smile was exhaustion, the kind that comes from walking on eggshells around someone you love. Those closest to the family would later say that Maurice's behavior had taken a darker turn. He'd become quick to anger, lashing out over the smallest things. He'd accuse Maria of lying, of keeping secrets, of disrespecting him. It wasn't about what she was doing, it was about control. He was losing it, and he couldn't stand it. Maria, for her part, had started to dream about escape. She'd talk about moving out once she turned 18, maybe going to college somewhere far away. Somewhere she could finally breathe. It was a dream she clung to quietly, because she knew it wouldn't sit well with her father. Those around her didn't realize it then, but that growing independence, that desire for freedom, was likely the spark that lit the fuse. Maurice's control wasn't just about authority. It was about identity. Being her father gave him purpose, and the thought of losing that role left him desperate. In his mind, Maria's independence wasn't a sign of maturity, it was betrayal. And desperation, when mixed with control, can become deadly. Investigators would later find evidence that Maurice had been under financial stress. It wasn't clear how deep it went, but the pressure was there: bills, strained relationships, and now, a daughter pulling away. The perfect storm. The week before Maria's death, friends noticed she was quieter than usual. She stopped responding to texts as often. Her posts slowed down. When she did show up at school or gatherings, she looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally drained. Her final week was marked by a growing distance from everything she loved. It was as if she knew something was coming, even if she couldn't name it. One classmate recalled that Maria mentioned wanting to spend the weekend with a friend, to get away from home for a while. But she never made it. That Friday night, she returned home to 900 Adele Street. It would be her last night alive. Inside that house, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Whatever had been simmering beneath the surface between father and daughter was about to erupt. But nobody outside those walls could have known just how bad it had become, or how far Maurice was willing to go to maintain control. Because when the storm finally broke, it would leave behind a scene that no one in Savannah would ever forget. July 20th, 2024. The sun had barely set over Savannah when the heat of the day settled into a sticky, restless night. The Pollock home on Adele Street sat in silence, the kind that feels unnatural, charged, like the air before a storm. Inside, 17-year-old Maria Pollock was in her room. The lights were on. Her phone charger glowed faintly by her bedside. Nothing about that night should have been different. But something in the air was already off. Maurice Pollock had been quiet all evening. Too quiet. He'd spent most of the day pacing through the house, muttering to himself. When he finally spoke to Maria, it started small, a disagreement, maybe about plans, maybe about a phone call she didn't answer. No one knows the exact words exchanged that night. What's known is that it escalated, fast and violently. Somewhere between frustration and fury, something inside Maurice broke. Years of tension, anger, fear of losing control, it all exploded in a single, horrific act of rage. What happened next can only be pieced together through the evidence investigators found later. The struggle began in the living room. There were signs of a fight: overturned furniture, a shattered picture frame, droplets of blood trailing across the floor. Police would later determine that Maurice attacked Maria with a box cutter, a weapon small enough to hide, but deadly in close range. Neighbors later told police they heard a scream, sharp, brief, and then, silence. For Maria, those moments must have been pure terror. The person she had trusted her entire life, the one who was supposed to protect her, had turned on her. Every instinct would have told her to run, but inside that small house, there was nowhere to go. The wounds she sustained were brutal. Investigators said the attack was frenzied, showing both rage and despair. It was not calculated. It was emotional, an explosion of violence that had likely been building for years. When it was over, the house fell quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels almost hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Maurice stood over his daughter's body, the reality of what he'd done crashing down like a wave. The anger was gone, replaced by shock. By guilt. By the horrifying realization that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. In the minutes that followed, he made his final, desperate choice. He retrieved a handgun and shot himself. The sound echoed through Adele Street, a single gunshot that cut through the night. It was that sound that brought neighbors to their windows, and one of them made the frantic call to 911. When officers arrived, the door was unlocked. They stepped into a scene that would haunt them for years. Maria's lifeless body was on the floor, surrounded by blood. Maurice was nearby, still breathing but barely. His gun lay inches from his hand. Paramedics rushed in, working quickly to stabilize Maurice. Maria was already gone. The 17-year-old who had dreamed of escaping that house would never leave it alive. The officers who responded that night would later describe it as one of the most disturbing scenes of their careers, not because of the violence itself, but because of the story it told. A father and daughter, locked in a cycle of control and pain, ending in unimaginable tragedy. Maurice was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. For days, he lingered between life and death. When he finally recovered, he was placed under arrest. The charge, malice murder, the most serious in Georgia law. News of the crime spread quickly through Savannah. The headline hit like a thunderclap, Savannah father accused of killing teenage daughter. To many, it didn't make sense. Those who knew the Pollocks described them as quiet, reserved, a normal family. But that's the thing about normal. It hides a lot. A tragedy born not from strangers, but from family. Within 24 hours, Savannah's tight-knit community was in mourning. Vigils were held outside the home. Candles lined the sidewalk. Photos of Maria, bright, smiling, full of life, stood against the backdrop of flashing lights and police tape. A young life, full of promise, stolen in a moment of madness. And yet, for all the pain, one question echoed louder than the rest: why? Why would a father do this to his own daughter? The truth is simple, and it's terrifying: love, when twisted by control and fear, can become something monstrous. And for Maria, the monster lived under the same roof. Inside, detectives began the painstaking process of piecing together the story of how a father's love had turned to lethal rage. Crime scene photos captured the chaos: a coffee table overturned, family photos cracked on the floor, droplets of blood marking the trail of the struggle. In the center of it all was the box cutter, the blade stained dark with dried blood. That small, ordinary tool would become the weapon that told investigators everything they needed to know. When Maurice Pollock was taken to the hospital, he was barely conscious. His gunshot wound was self-inflicted but not immediately fatal. Detectives waited until he was stable before questioning him, though at first, he said very little. He seemed distant, dazed, like a man staring at the ruins of his own life. As forensic teams processed the scene, the timeline of that night slowly came into focus. It started with an argument, one that spiraled out of control. The attack was sudden, vicious, and ended only when Maurice turned the gun on himself. Police found Maria's phone near her body. In the hours before her death, she had texted a friend, nothing alarming, just small talk. But that phone would soon become a silent witness. Investigators pulled data showing repeated missed calls and messages from Maurice earlier that evening. Dozens of them. He had been trying to reach her, and when she didn't respond, his temper flared. It was a pattern police recognized all too well: the cycle of control, the rage that follows defiance, and the violence that ends it all. The Savannah Police Department's homicide unit ruled it quickly: this was a domestic homicide. There was no mystery suspect, no search for a killer. The killer was already in custody. But that didn't make the story easier to tell, or to hear. For the detectives who worked the case, the hardest part wasn't finding out what happened. It was confronting why. They learned that Maurice had been under tremendous personal stress. He'd lost work months earlier, was facing mounting financial pressure, and seemed to be spiraling emotionally. Those who knew him described him as a man holding everything in. When Maria started asserting her independence, spending more time with friends, talking about moving out, it might have triggered something deep in him. That night, investigators believed, was the breaking point. After the attack, Maurice shot himself in what they described as an immediate act of remorse. He survived, but his daughter did not. Forensic specialists reconstructed every second of the crime through blood pattern analysis and wound mapping. They concluded Maria had fought back, hard. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, proof that she tried to protect herself. It painted a picture that was almost unbearable to imagine, a daughter's final fight for her life against the very man who gave it to her. It was the kind of picture that said, everything's fine. But behind it was a reality that couldn't have been more broken. Once Maurice recovered enough to stand trial, the case moved into the hands of prosecutors. They had what they needed, the weapon, the forensics, and the confession. There was no question of guilt, only of punishment. Because how do you move on when the person responsible isn't a stranger, but family? Maria's story became more than a crime, it became a warning. A mirror reflecting how fragile safety can be, even inside your own home. The courtroom in Chatham County was silent as Maurice Pollock was led in. The chains around his wrists clinked softly with every step. His face was gaunt, his expression blank, a man hollowed out by the consequences of his own actions. 17 months had passed since the night on Adele Street, yet for those sitting in the gallery, Maria's loved ones, friends, and community members, the wounds were as raw as ever. When the charges were read aloud, malice murder, possession of a knife during the commission of a crime, and aggravated assault, Maurice barely reacted. The words hung heavy in the air, each one like a blow. He didn't look up. He didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his hands trembling ever so slightly. The prosecution's case was straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, Maria's blood on the box cutter, the 911 call, the self-inflicted gunshot wound. There were no mysteries left to solve. What remained was accountability. In a move that surprised no one, Maurice entered a guilty plea to the charge of malice murder. There would be no trial, no defense, no claims of insanity or denial. The plea spared Maria's family the anguish of reliving every gruesome detail in front of a jury. But it also meant that the full story of why he did it, what was going through his mind that night, might never be fully known. When the prosecutor finished, the judge asked Maurice if he had anything to say before sentencing. He stood slowly, his voice weak, trembling. What he said was brief, an apology that barely escaped his throat. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be. The judge's words that followed were measured, deliberate, but filled with gravity. He said the court could not comprehend the depth of the pain Maurice had caused, not only to his daughter but to everyone who loved her. And though nothing could undo the horror of that night, the law demanded its answer. Maurice Pollock was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole, though he would not even be eligible to apply until he had served 30 years. The gavel fell, echoing through the courtroom like a final heartbeat. It was over. But for Maria's family, it didn't feel like justice. Because no amount of years behind bars could bring her back. As Maurice was led away, he didn't look back. The door closed behind him, sealing his fate. The man who had once tucked his daughter into bed would now spend the rest of his life behind steel bars, his freedom traded for the memory of the crime that defined him. For Maria's family, the sentence was both a relief and a reminder. Relief that he would never walk free again for decades. Reminder that nothing could undo the loss of the girl who had once filled their lives with light. One family member, through tears, told a reporter, "We just want people to remember her. Not how she died, but who she was." In that single sentence lay the truest form of justice Maria could ever receive. Because while her father's name would fade behind prison walls, hers would live on, in the community that mourned her, in the friends who carried her memory, and in every person who heard her story and refused to let it be forgotten. The courtroom emptied slowly, the heavy wooden doors closing behind the last of the spectators. And for the first time in over a year, the story of the Pollocks was no longer evidence or testimony. It was tragedy, sealed, judged, and left to echo in memory. But for Savannah, and for every parent and child who had watched this story unfold, the question lingered: how does love twist so far that it becomes hate? Savannah tried to move on, but the shadow of what happened inside that small house on Adele Street refused to fade. Maria Pollock's friends gathered often, sometimes at Forsyth Park, where she used to take late evening walks with her camera. They'd sit under the oak trees and talk about her laugh, her sketches, the way she used to make plans for a future that would never come. She had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of traveling, of someday starting a family of her own. But those dreams died the moment her father decided to end her story. Her mother, once a quiet woman, rarely spoke publicly. But when she did, it was always the same message, that Maria's story should serve as a warning, a lesson about the hidden storms that can live inside the walls we call home. She often said, "You never really know what someone is capable of until it's too late." Neighbors remembered the Pollocks as ordinary. No one saw it coming. The same man who used to wave from his driveway, who fixed his daughter's bicycle, who helped the elderly woman next door carry her groceries, that man became the monster of a nightmare no one could wake up from. Some couldn't stop asking why. Why a father who raised his daughter could turn against her? Why the violence, the rage, the knife? Why that night? But those questions had no answers. There was no logic left in what Maurice had done, only pain, confusion, and a silence that words could never fill. Maria's story made headlines for weeks, but her family made sure her name didn't fade into another forgotten statistic. They started a small foundation in her memory, dedicated to helping families affected by domestic violence and mental health struggles. On their website, beneath her smiling photo, the words read, "She deserved a future. Others still can have one." That legacy, quiet, compassionate, and brave, became the light that her father's crime could never extinguish. In the end, the story of Maria Pollock isn't just about a murder. It's about a betrayal so deep that it fractured the very meaning of family. It's about how evil can wear the face of love, and how tragedy can hide behind ordinary walls until it explodes into something unthinkable. And though Maurice Pollock will spend the rest of his life behind prison bars, his punishment will never balance the loss of the girl who trusted him most. Because that's the haunting truth about tragedy, it doesn't end when the verdict is read. It lingers. It echoes. It reminds us of what was lost, and of what we must never allow to happen again. And so, as the candles burn low in Savannah and the whispers fade into the night, one question remains, one that will never truly be answered. How does love turn into something deadly? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Fatal Whispers. Turn on notifications, so you never miss another story, stories that remind us that behind every whisper tells a story. The story of Maria Pollock, may she rest in peace.